My name is Judy Shaw. I am from the University of Vermont, and I'm also on the APA Board of Directors. And we are thrilled this afternoon to bring you this session entitled Healthy Brains, Healthy Bodies, Influencing Neuroplasticity Through Health Promotion. I should probably have it memorized by now. I just wanted to say for about 5 years, I've said to my colleague, Jim Hudziak, who works in Vermont, you're talking to the wrong audience. You're talking to child psychiatrists. We really need to get you in front of the pediatricians. And every year he said to me, So this past year, I put together this plenary session and brought some of Jim's colleagues along. And then I just knew who I needed to have close this session, and that's Tom Boat. And many of you know Tom. I will introduce each person as they come up to speak. As you can tell, we've got 3 different computers up here, so bear with us as we use technology to switch over to what I hope is an amazing session for you. So I'm going to kick off. We have changed the order of the speakers, as you've noticed. It's in the program. Dr. Margaret Martin's going to go first, Dr. Krause second, Dr. Hudziak third, and Dr. Boat fourth. And we will do our best to keep to the times on this slide. But I'd like to introduce Margaret Martin, who I just met for the first time today. She is a nationally known person who has been featured on NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, PBS, The Atlantic, for her work that she's done founding the Harmony Project in 2001 in Los Angeles, and gives instruments and tuition-free group and private music lessons to thousands of the most vulnerable children in LA. Her awards include the 2011 Presidential Citizens Medal from President Barack Obama, and her research focuses on neurological, academic, and behavioral impact of sustained music learning on disadvantaged youth. So I turn it over to Margaret Martin.
Thanks very much, Tony. So I'm at a farmer's market in Hollywood, and a posse of gnarly-looking LA gang members comes walking through the market. Shaved heads, tattoos, oversized clothing. They stop in front of a small child playing Brahms on a tiny violin. After 5 or 6 minutes, without saying a word to one another, I watched those gang members pull out their own money and lay it gently in the child's case. I was at UCLA at the time, completing a doctorate in public health focused on what it takes to make a healthy community. And those gang members were teaching me that they would rather be doing what that child was doing than what they were doing. But they never had the chance. I dug into the research literature, and I found that music training was linked to improvements in math, language, cognition, brain development, and behavior. And I wanted to try to capture those positive benefits for high-need kids. So in 2001, when I'd completed my degree, I launched Harmony Project with 36 disadvantaged kids, won $9,000 check from Rotary Club of Hollywood, and a small band of intrepid, naive founding board members. 8 years later, I was at the White House receiving the highest honor in the nation for an arts-based youth program from Michelle Obama. So the idea was to engage and challenge and mentor children throughout childhood through the study of and practice and performance of music. We can all use mentors in our lives, but most disadvantaged kids are not going to sign up for a multi-year mentoring program. The very cool thing is that it takes your whole life to learn to make music well. So we train charismatic musicians, professional musicians, who enjoy kids and who can pass a background check as the mentors. Our mission, to invest in the positive development of children through the study, practice, and performance of music, to build healthier communities by investing in the positive development of children through music, and to develop children as musical ambassadors of peace, hope, and understanding amongst children of diverse cultures, backgrounds, and beliefs. Our kids often tell us that they grow up in Harmony Project, they've grown up making music in Harmony Project with kids they never would have spoken to otherwise. And we don't talk about the value of diversity, but the value of diversity is not something that you teach with flip charts on MLK Day. The value of diversity is best taught, from my perspective, by teaching kids to make music together, because you've got the flutes and you've got the cellos and you've got the clarinets. You've got all these different voices and they sound better together. I like to say that the members of Congress would be far more functional if they had grown up within Harmony Project. So Harmony Project is a research-based public health intervention. We engage children from 4 to 18 from low-income homes. We focus on the social determinants of health from a primary prevention perspective. We don't do enough primary prevention in this country. It's not smart that we don't, but anyway, we're a strengths-based approach. And this is really, really important because we're not trying to fix disadvantaged kids. We're trying to develop their amazing talent and capacity. And nobody wants to come in and get fixed. But we have over 500 kids on a wait list and a 3-year wait to get into the program in LA's gang zones because we respect the capacity of our kids and develop it. So replicable, scalable, and sustainable. So background, you're probably aware by 4th grade, poor kids of every race tend to be at least 2 grade levels behind their more advantaged peers. By 8th grade, the gap is 3 years. By 12th grade, if they're still in school, the gap is 4 years. Dropout rates are per the last census, more than 50% of Black and Hispanic kids who enter kindergarten do not finish high school. Reducing the number of dropouts by half in the city of LA alone would generate at least $1 billion in economic benefits and result in 3,659 fewer murders and aggravated assaults each year. That's a UC Santa Barbara Graduate School of Education 2009 report. So the social benefits are vast of reducing dropout. And McKinsey and Company lets us understand that we're looking at huge costs. This is what we spend, this is the default cost, impact on gross domestic product. So what we exactly do, we call it mentoring through music, 5 to 12 hours a week, year-round, tuition-free, based on family income. School enrollment is required, so dropout just disappears. Our ensembles are based on competence, not on student age. So you know that the 9 and 10 and 11-year-old who's in an ensemble with a 14 and 15 and 16-year-old is really full of themselves. And by the way, peer pressure, we love peer pressure. Peer pressure gets a terrible rap, but peer pressure is what makes the kids in a section practice so they don't make the section sound bad. And the ones that are sounding really good say, let me help you with that. They're all going for the same thing, and we have a family engagement strategy that includes parents and siblings. So what kind of outcomes have we seen with our kids? Well, this is a quote from one of our kids. We have kids leaving gangs. We don't talk about leaving gangs. But as they learn increasingly challenging music over multiple years, in this just an authentic, positive program, they make that determination themselves. And the interesting thing is that kids get recruited into gangs by 1st or 2nd grade. Our affiliate in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is at the largest Title I elementary school in Tulsa. The principal of that school is a member of the board of Harmony Project Tulsa, and she tells us that kids are recruited into gangs by 2nd grade at her school. So we started Harmony Project in Tulsa at age 4, and the kids are now age 4, 5, and 6. But they don't really know what gangs mean when they get recruited, but by the time they do, they face retaliation, injury, or death if they try to leave. And this is real. So what we found, and what our kids have told us, is that even their gang-involved family members support their effort to do music. Music is considered positive and it's considered neutral, so it's a safe segue out of a gang life. This is what it feels like to a kid in Harmony Project. I can focus better now. I don't know why. But suddenly everything that's happening in school is starting to make sense. And again, harmony is where you go to get rid of all the stress in your life. When I was 15, I did not have that place to go. It's pretty remarkable, but our kids are living in the highest crime gang zones in LA with alcoholic or addicted parents, often in and out of homelessness, experiencing food insecurity. We talk a lot about PTSD in this country. Our kids are not experiencing PTSD. They're experiencing chronic traumatic stress. And so Harmony Project is that refuge. They refer to Harmony Project as their second family, their sanctuary, or their refuge. In Los Angeles, we've got more than 300 classes a week, dozens of ensembles, more than 2,000 kids, again, more than 500 on our wait list. A kid graduated from high school. In his exit interview, he mentioned that his mom had signed him up in 4th grade, but he was able to start in 7th grade because that's how long it took. And there he was graduating from high school. We have affiliated programs now in 9 other regions across 7 states, and many more are developing. And I'm responsible for helping to get new programs going. So, as I've said, we've received 2 major White House honors. Last year, we were designated a 2015 Bright Spot in Hispanic Education by the U.S. Department of Education in an initiative with the White House. And if any of you watched the Super Bowl halftime show, you saw 40 of our string kids from South LA's gang zones playing on the stage with Bruno Mars, Beyonce, and Coldplay. There they are wearing their Pepsi-colored jackets. This is what blew our minds. All of those things are fun and they're amazing, but since 2008, more than 90% of our high school seniors who've participated in Harmony Project at least 3 years have not only graduated high school, but they've gone on to college. Our class of 2016 had an average time in program of 7 years, and that's at 5 to 12 hours per week. Average. We've had 2 Fulbright scholars. Our first doctor graduated last spring from UC San Francisco's Graduate School of Dentistry. When she was an undergrad, her mom could not tell me what she was studying as an undergrad. In Spanish, her mom could not tell me that. To put the Fulbright scholars in perspective, it's the second Fulbright scholar we had graduated from Cal State Chico, a degree in political science and a second degree in Spanish language and literature. Chico State's been around since 1887. Fulbright's been around since 1946. In their entire history and all the hundreds of thousands of students they've had go through that university, she was their second ever Fulbright scholar. Harmony Project at the time had been around 14 years. We recruit exclusively from high crime gang zones. We start kids when they're little. You can't even apply for a Fulbright until you graduate in college, and we've had 2. It's just so far out the tail of any reasonable distribution, it didn't make any sense. So we were seeing the outcomes that we were seeing with our kids didn't make any sense. I should also say that as our students advance, we train them to mentor their less advanced peers. So we create this positive network. So as an academic, this bothered me a lot. So I bothered a lot of people. And eventually I found myself speaking to the head of child health and human development at the NIH. Can you help us understand what is going on here? Because the social science, it's not there. I'm a social scientist, and nothing in the literature could explain what we were seeing on such a wholesale and consistent level with the most disadvantaged kids in the highest crime neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So she referred me to this woman, who you will hear tell the second part of the story.
So next, I'd like to introduce Nina Kraus. She is a professor of neurobiology and physiology, otolaryngology, and the Hughes Knowles Chair at Northwestern University. She is a leading expert on the neurobiology underlying speech, music perception, and learning associated with brain plasticity. And she's going to finish the rest of Margaret's story.
All right. So I get to talk about music and language. And I'm going to start out just sound. Sound is invisible, and yet it is incredibly powerful. It is what roots us in communication. And if you think about it for a minute, a lot of very, very powerful forces in the world, like electricity and magnetism, are invisible. They're powerful. Sound is very powerful, and sometimes people don't notice. Sound, making sense of sound, is absolutely essential for any child development and for learning in a classroom. A little bit about my lab. So I'm a biologist, and we study how our life and sound changes the nervous system. And we look at how different forms of enrichment, so it can be musical training or speaking another language, impacts our nervous system, impacts how our brain responds to sound, and also how different forms of disorder, deprivation, and decline are impacted by our life in sound. A little bit about me is I'm a biologist, and I started out studying the biology of learning firsthand at the single neuron level. This was in bunny rabbits. And we still have an animal model, and it's really compelling to see how cellular activity changes with experience, and especially with experience with sound. A lot of our work now involves more human folks, but always there is this thread of biology. So today what I want to talk about is something about the biology of reading. So what do we know about sound processing in the brain in ways that it affects our language and reading skills? I will talk about poverty, but poverty indexed by linguistic deprivation, okay? So this is all language-based. And then talk about the impact of musical experience on language development. All of this, I hope, will really make sense to you because you're pediatricians. You are interested in pediatric care, chronic pediatric care, and the extent to which we can identify early risk and monitor outcomes. And the biology, I hope to convince you, can really help us here. So when we think about making sense of sound, you just think, okay, well, sound comes into the ear, goes up to the brain, and what is really important, and again, often overlooked, just as sound is overlooked because it's invisible, very important are these pathways that inform our hearing system based on how we interact with sound in our lives. The sound to meaning connections we make. So how we think about sound, how we remember sound, what we pay attention to, and how we feel about it. So we talk about hearing as really involving sensory, cognitive, and reward networks. And this is how learning happens. So again, sound is huge, hearing is huge, making sense of sound. And music, it turns out, as a function of learning, is really engages these systems very well. So how do we measure sound processing in the brain? Well, we use scalp electrodes, and it's a matter of, as of course you know, when you deliver sound, anytime you're listening to sound, the nerves in your brain that respond to sound give off electricity, which we can measure with scalp electrodes. And if you look at the sound wave and the brain wave, what do you notice? They resemble each other, right? It's kind of interesting, right? The sound wave and the brain wave actually resemble each other. So in other words, we have really unprecedented access to fine-grained processing in the brain that enables us to get this kind of precision. And what we're able to do, actually, when I first looked at this, I thought, well, okay, you can just take this signal, this electricity, feed it back through my speaker, like I do with my electric guitar, and it will sound like the sound wave, and it sort of does. So here's a sound wave, a speech sound, and here's the brain wave. Some more examples. You'll hear a scale and the brain's response to the scale. Little Mozart, and then the brain comes in. Okay, and my favorite, a little Deep Purple. Okay, so the fact is, we have a lot to work with. We have a lot to work with. We've never really had so much to work with that is useful, that gives us information on an individual subject level and on an individual, we're talking about individual kids that we're interested in. Of course, we're interested in groups, but you really want to know, how do I think about this one child that is in front of me? So when we get a response like this from the brain, I said that you had a lot of rich information. Well, just from one brain response, we can see different ingredients of sound processing, just from the consonant portion and the vowel portion that relate to the pitch, timing, and timbre of the sound. Actually, there are many more ingredients. This is just a simplification, but there's a huge amount of information that one can obtain from a single sound wave. And what we can do then is figure out how good a job one individual brain is doing at processing those ingredients biologically. So what's important is that this isn't a volume knob effect. That's why the mixing board analogy is a good one, because if you have a language delayed system, it's not that all aspects of sound processing are diminished. Or if you're a musician, it's not that all aspects of sound processing are enhanced. There really are individual ingredients that are impaired and that are strengthened, and trying to understand these mechanisms better can really help us understand risk and what to do about it. So an expert system, for example, a musician might hear this phrase in this manner.
I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
Where's this from? You guys are so shy. And move up. So a disordered brain might hear it more like this.
I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
So if you're a child raised in poverty with linguistic deprivation, you might be hearing sound like that in a classroom, kind of difficult to make sense of sound. So the biological measure that we're using is, how many of you are familiar with ABR, with brainstem responses that happen at birth, right? We call this CABR because we are looking at responses to complex sounds on the order of microseconds. But it comes from frequency following response technology. What's important is that, and I really regret having named this thing CABR because the B word. People think of brainstem and they think of low-level processing when in fact our auditory system works as a circuit and is very, very informed by experience. Even our hair cells are informed by musicians' hair cells work differently than someone who does not have musical experience. So by using complex sounds and looking at these responses in a complex way, we really have a tremendous amount of information that reflects cognitive, sensory, and reward processing. So we have a measure that's objective, that's well vetted, it's mobile, it's fast, repeatable, and uniform. So it really can provide us a biological framework for early screening, evaluating outcomes. And for importantly, I made this point before, but I always have to hear things about 80 times to get them to sink in. This is just twice, is we need the information in individual people. And this information is very, very, just as an ABR, is these recordings, these responses are very informative on an individual level. Okay, and we really want to know how is it that we can understand language outcomes and predict who is at risk for language difficulty. So how do we apply the neuroscience? Well, for example, we really can predict reading ability. And so by measuring the response to speech sounds that are presented in background noise, what we can do is, if we look at the response just here to the consonant and look at a couple of ingredients of sound processing, what we're able to do is when we measure these responses in a 3-year-old, we not only have insight right then and there into this 3-year-old's child development, and I know that it's difficult to assess kids when they're 3 years old. Biologically, with this, it's very, very easy. You just have the kid watch a movie, put these electrodes on, and you measure what his brain has become, how his brain responds to sound based on his life in sound, and the combination of what he was born with. And so we know what his language development is like at 3, but more remarkably, from the 3-year-old, we can predict what his language is going to be like when he's 4 years old and 5 years old. And more important still, we can predict who is at risk, who is going to have difficulty struggling learning to read later on. Okay? So we can really look into a child's language future. And I encourage you to take a look at this article in PLOS Biology. Also, NPR did a really nice study piece on this. And they're very good at kind of bringing the science out. So what does this have to do with auditory enrichment? Okay? So say that we have a child that we have identified as being in risk. What can we do about it? And how can, again, we use biology to inform us? So it turns out that language and music abilities really do coincide. And we have done a number of studies across the lifespan, really looking at how the impact of musical experience changes how the brain responds to sound, and in particular, how these particular sound ingredients are improved and how they track with language. So these are cross-sectional studies in preschoolers, school-age kids, young adults, and older adults. And then we have 2 school-based neuroeducation projects, one in the Chicago area, Chicago Public Schools, and the other in Margaret Martin's Harmony Project, where we've tracked kids over 3 to 6 years. So, making sense of sound really requires that you be able to make sense of a complex soundscape. And music is inherently that. So just the musicians here have to be able to pull out the sound of their own instrument. They have to be able to hear harmony and melody lines. That's not that different from hearing a teacher's voice in a noisy classroom. So one of the first things that we wanted to determine was whether people with musical experience were better at hearing speech in noise. And the answer, resoundingly, is yes. Across the lifespan, see if you can hear the sentence embedded here. Anybody hear a sentence? How about this?
Sugar is very sweet.
You heard it now, right? What was it? Thank you. All right, and this has been replicated. This is solid information, which again, as a biologist, I'm interested in these very complex issues like language and music, and yet what makes me comfortable is being able to interact with it in a very objective and signally way. I'm very much of a signals geek, looking at the details of sound waves and the details of the electricity, which is the currency of our nervous system. And you can just see here, here's a musician's response to a speech sound in quiet and in noise. You can see that the noise really has not impacted the response very much. It's just as good in noise as it is in quiet, whereas the non-musician, you can just see that the non-musician's response to speech has really taken a hit. Auditory working memory. It's essential for you to make any sense of what I'm saying now, you have to remember what I just said. And the standardized tests of working memory where you give kids a list of words and you ask the kids to repeat back, the names of words that begin with the letter D. And so they have to think about, okay, which words did I hear and which ones start with D, and repeat them back to you. You really strengthen this with music. Just to tune your instrument, you have to remember what the sound sounds like. To improvise, if you have a musical idea and I'm going to improvise on it, I need to remember it. So you're constantly strengthening your auditory working memory. And again, what the data show is that across the lifespan, people with musical experience are simply better at auditory working memory tasks involving language. Let me say a few words about rhythm. So rhythm is obvious for music. It turns out to be very, very important for language as well, because rhythm tells you where important events stop and start. It tells you about word boundaries. It tells you about emphasis. Rhythm in speech is extremely important. And I'm not just saying this. There has been a whole line of research, especially by a group in Cambridge, that has shown us that a kid's ability to simply tap along to a beat tracks with their language skills. Okay? We are looking at some of this in little kids. We have a project that we call BioTots, where we're looking at kids beginning at age 3. And here they are tapping along. And I want you to listen to one little guy who's tapping along to a drum. And here's another guy. So he's enthusiastic. But what is really kind of fascinating is that the synchronizer really does have better language skills in ways that we can measure, especially as the kids get older and we get better at measuring the language skills. But we can see it already in the 3-year-olds really beautifully in the brain waves. Here are the rhythms of the speech wave, and the brain waves of the synchronizer are simply following those rhythms better. And we can quantify this. And we can determine, is this child at risk for a language problem? And we can monitor outcomes. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about disrupting sound processing in the brain. From animal models, because remember, I'm just this basic science biologist deep down, and we know that the auditory brain in animals and in humans is arranged exquisitely. There is a low to high frequency map that occurs again and again. And if you take animals and rear them in low-level noise, so this is safe noise, this is not, this is like the sound of your air conditioner, but you rear these animals in meaningless noise, and this beautiful organization of the hearing system becomes disrupted. This is important. How many of you, have families in your practice who like to use these noisemakers to keep their babies less disturbed when they're sleeping? Right? This is a really bad idea from what science is showing us. Because a child, a child who's 3 years old, he's looking for meaning in sounds. He can't help but learn a language because that's what his brain does. And so if you have him listen for hours and hours and hours to sound that has no meaning, this organization that should be occurring gets tampered with. So let's talk about auditory enrichment. Again, in animal studies, if you can take an animal, and here's the usual orientation of frequency tuning from low to high frequencies, and you expose the animal to, very low-level noise, and you disrupt this organization. If you now have the animal in an enriched auditory environment, over time, this damage gets fixed. And in that same amount of time, if the animal is reared in silence or in continuous, just meaningless sound, then the damage remains. There have been a number of studies. We know intensive care units are very, very, very noisy places. And there's not much we can do about the noise. It's keeping children alive. But studies have been done where in the intensive care unit, again, babies have been exposed to the sound of their mom's voice, to their mom's heartbeat, and objective measures of brain development have been monitored such that the child who is receiving this auditory enrichment has a brain that is developing faster and more healthily. Similarly, if you just look at a measure of heart rate with no sound, and then you have actually live music, it turns out that live music, not only for the moment, but over time, soothes the baby to the point where heart rate is calmer. Is this a familiar picture? Here are kids constantly with middle ear problems, and do you ever wonder about the impact on their language development? Well, this is something that I think that biologically we can begin to access when we look towards the future. So let me get back to people again in schools. And talk about poverty and sound. So linguistic deprivation is often measured by maternal education. Poverty is often indexed by maternal education. This is a group that knows about the 30 million word gap of children who, if their moms have less education, are going to likely hear about 30 million fewer words than children raised by a mom who has more education. And that's because this is meaningful sound, sound to meaning connections in language and music. The other thing that happens in low-income neighborhoods is that these neighborhoods tend also to be noisier. They're often close to airports and bus stations. And again, this idea of having meaningless sound is something that disrupts the normal architecture of sound to meaning connections. So what have we learned when we studied kids from low-income areas? What we did is we simply divided these kids based on their mom's education. So these are kids who are in the same classrooms. They are all going to these low-income schools where over 90% of the kids qualify for subsidized lunch. And we simply divided the kids based on how much education their mother had and looked at their brain responses to sound. And what we found was that the kids whose moms had less education had more just inherent neural noise in their system. This is in the absence of any stimulation, that there was just this background noise, and importantly, on top of it, the sound processing of these ingredients that we know are absolutely essential for language development were not processed well. And so the analogy that I think is a really powerful one is if you think about a child who is listening to the radio and there's static in the radio because you're not tuned into the station. So there's static in the background, and on top of it, the announcer's voice is sounding muffled. It's very hard to learn. And we can just see this very, very, very objectively in the biology. Margaret talked about the achievement gap. This is very well known, and we wanted to know whether music education and making music would help offset this achievement gap. And it really is the case that Margaret and the founder of the programs in Chicago, they came to me saying, well, we already know that the children who are making music are better learners. What is going on in their brains? And so we have looked at this over the years. There's a lot of information about the work that it's been published. It's on our website if it's of interest and of help to you. But really what we were able, using this mixing board analogy, again, we know that there are certain ingredients of sound processing that are diminished, disrupted in a child who is living in poverty, a child with maternal deprivation. And what we have been able to find excuse me, sure, is that making music doesn't completely fix the problem, of course, but it can partially offset this impact of low maternal education, linguistic deprivation. Thank you. What else have we learned? We have learned that it takes time. So both in the Chicago-based project and in our Los Angeles Harmony project, after 1 year of musical training, we saw no biological change in the brain's response to sound. After 2 years, in both cohorts, so these are adolescents and in elementary school kids, it took 2 years. And then we saw these very, very, very completely objective measures that told us that the nervous system is processing ingredients that are essential for making meaning of language better. And the kids who put in more time and more effort, they also made the greatest gains biologically. Importantly, these are the kids who did better with their literacy skills and also their hearing and noise skills. And this last thing, so how many of you played music sometime in your life? How many of you are regularly making music these days? So the fact is that the legacy of music, it lasts. And we have found that years after music education has stopped, because you have made those important sound to meaning connections as a child, again and again and again, and you've reinforced them through your use of sound throughout your life, even decades later, we see that people who have had musical instruction have better responses to speech. So to sum things up, we really do know that auditory learning, for better or for worse, changes the nervous system. And music, making music. Somebody's going to ask me, oh, I listen to music all the time. What about listening to music? I like to say you're not going to get physically fit watching sports. So, and it takes time. It's not a quick fix, so you can't just take a pill and be done with it. Biologically, we are what we do. Biologically, our past shapes our present. And I think that it's really important to use biology to inform pediatric care for risk identification and for monitoring outcomes. So what we're hoping to do is to overcome the barriers to make this kind of technology more readily available. I'm working to create a cost-effective and user-friendly platform to make it so that this kind of assessment can be made in any pediatrician's office. Because right now, the technology is expensive and it's rather complicated to interpret, but this really doesn't have to be. And so this again is where I'm seeing the very near future going. And beyond that, really being able to assess kids at birth. I mean, you already know that you can assess whether a kid has hearing thresholds that are abnormal at birth using ABR. There's no reason why you can't use CABR, look at these responses to complex sounds, and be able to determine, is this child at risk for processing sound, for making sense of sound? So again, the goal here is to use biology to inform pediatric care for risk identification and outcomes. I need to acknowledge the wonderful, wonderful people who I work with at Northwestern University in my lab. They do all the heavy lifting. And I want to invite you, please, to visit our magical website. We spend a lot of time trying to communicate the science we do to different audiences. And for each one of the topics that we study, we have friendly overview slideshows where we'll have a picture and a line of text that summarizes 2 years of work. But you can go as deep as you want. You can download the publications. So please check out the website. I have some cards here if you would like to take one with you afterwards. And thank you for your attention.
Our last speaker probably doesn't need any introduction in this group, but it's Tom Boat, who's a professor of pediatrics at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. Of note, he's a past president of SPR and APS, and he was also one of our St. Gem awardees in the past.
Let me share from a pediatric perspective what I think we are in a position to do and talk a little bit about what might be done. By the way, let me just talk about music therapy too, because I said to Margaret Martin beforehand, if my mother were here, I'd say it was, anything that I've been able to do is because she rolled me out of bed at 6 o'clock every morning to do my piano and trumpet practice. But I started thinking, and I'm going to go home, and I'm going to tell my oldest daughter, who was a teenager in the 70s, that it was her exposure for me of Led Zeppelin that gave me all the advantages I had. So I really do appreciate this opportunity. In my opinion, this is a session that addresses a frontier in pediatric medicine, promoting cognitive and behavioral wellness of children. This is a dimension of early health that we now know is inextricably linked to overall child and lifelong health and well-being. As Jim showed, we're well aware that U.S. doesn't fare very well in comparing its population health outcomes with those of developing countries, and that failure to respond to social determinants of health and resulting health disparities are large contributors to these outcomes. Mediating factors include inability to promote cognitive and behavioral health of many of our children. And frankly, pediatrics has been handcuffed in the past, not only by segmentation of behavioral health, but by the fact that we really have turned a blind eye to our responsibility to be keepers of comprehensive health for children. Comprehensive means physical health and behavioral health. And if we come to a realization that we need to operate in that mode, children will be advantaged. I think our practices will be a lot more fun also. Fortunately, there's increasing interest in the pediatric community. If you looked at some of the presentations this morning, there were some great presentations that focus on social determinants and kinds of interventions that could be done. But I think you understand that a big segment of the pediatric community does not get it at this time. And so we really do need, in our academic settings, we have programs now and so on and so forth. But I'll tell you, even at Children's Hospital in Cincinnati, I work with a lot of folks who don't really understand that if we, in fact, don't pay attention to the behavioral dimensions of health, we are not going to help kids stay well, get better if they need to get better, and live a long and healthy and productive life. So my intent today is to sound a call of action on the part of the entire pediatric community. You know that I came from a subspecialty background. Those of us who are subspecialists, I think, have been particularly slow in recognizing the importance of fostering this part of healthcare and wellness. So I'll push hard for our community to be more aware of opportunities to promote cognitive and behavioral health, also to recognize risks, and to respond effectively to mitigate those risks. We are privileged to take care of children at the start of life. I just ask this, is there not a more favorable place to intervene, to provide families with the kind of encouragement, education, and support they need to do the best for their children? So my eyes were opened in 2009 when I was asked to co-chair a consensus committee, and the report of which came out under the title Preventing Mental, Emotional, and Behavioral Disorders Among Young People. We call them MEB disorders. Some startling facts became clear to me. Averaging the available point prevalence for behavioral disorders at that time showed 17% of U.S. children ages 3 through 17 had a diagnosable MEB disorder, and this 17% figure didn't include spectrum or autism spectrum disorders, didn't include intellectual or learning disabilities. The prevalence of individual disorders speaks to the frequent occurrence. The individual percentages all add up to more than 17. So you can see that there's obviously comorbidity in many of these cases, and it's comorbidity that seems to, in fact, create or magnify disability. 40% of youth experienced at least one MEB disorder by 25 years of age. And what we learned in that committee was that there are many evidence-based early childhood interventions that could change these outcomes. Why is pediatrics not more involved in picking up those that we can adapt and incorporate into our practices in such a way that we can change the outcomes? As reported from a recent National Academy of Science consensus study, the number of children receiving Medicaid reimbursed services for a primary diagnosis of an MEB disorder doubled in the first decade of the 21st century. In 10 years, it doubled. The increase occurred for all major behavioral diagnoses, as you can see. We are spending our resources rescuing children, and apparently we aren't doing a very good job of it. Too many are drowning, and we need a new strategy, one that embraces wellness promotion and risk prevention as outlined in the 2009 IOM report. So here is how I view the cascade of health-related consequences of childhood MEB disorders. They are well known to be antecedent to adult disorders. So the arrow goes this direction. As Jim told you, many adult psychiatric diagnoses can be traced to behavioral disorders in the first 2 decades of life, probably a substantial majority of them. Child health care unequivocally has an opportunity to reduce MEB disorders across the lifespan. MEB disorders occurring in a parent are also a risk factor for childhood MEB disorders. And a case in point there is depression in the parent, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Furthermore, both childhood and adult behavioral disorders are major risk factors for medical, that is, non-behavioral disorders. We can pick many: obesity, hypertension, type 2 diabetes. Currently, these chronic medical disorders also carry a high risk for mental health problems, both in children and adults. So we go round and round. In a way, this is a vicious cycle as much as a cascade. And interrupting this cascade, or better yet, avoiding it, should be our goal. But I don't think that we have a systematic approach. My message today is that it's high time for pediatrics to partner with families and other health professions of a like mind to address more effectively the risks for childhood cognitive and MEB disorders. To do so, our agenda should prominently include cognitive and behavioral health promotion, things such as provision of secure environments, verbal stimulation, sleep, nutrition, exercise. You've heard all of this, less screen time, starting as early in a child's life as possible. Pediatric efforts also should include prevention of risks by adapting evidence-based screening and intervention strategies that are designed to provide stronger nurturing in the home. Finally, our efforts should also include early detection of problems such as childhood aggressive behaviors and provide for prompt and effective interventions. These are things we can do in our offices if in fact we systematically set them up to do so. Conversely, the impact of maternal depression on a child's cognitive and behavioral development can be reduced by early detection and treatment of the mother. So I will also address how early interventions can reduce the pernicious efforts, the pernicious effects of childhood chronic diseases on behavioral health. All 3 levels of support for child and family can be initiated and ideally provided in our child health care settings. Let me give an example of what we know and what pediatrics might do, and this relates to auditory function. We are well aware that maternal depression is a major risk for the provision of early childhood nurturance and cognitive emotional development. Studies conducted at Every Child Succeeds, a Cincinnati metropolitan-wide home visitation program, have demonstrated that greater than 40% of mothers, first-time mothers who are single and resource poor, have clinically identifiable depression. A study by Dr. Scott Holland and his colleagues in the neuroimaging program at Cincinnati Children's of the children of some of these mothers is beginning to shed light on the neurologic basis for the childhood developmental deficits. MRI demonstration of blood oxygenation in the auditory cortex while listening to a book reader is surprisingly intensified in children whose mothers are depressed. However, connectivity of the auditory cortex to other areas of the brain is dramatically reduced, at least in preliminary studies during the same task. These children are perhaps hearing but not optimally processing the words. I'm not sure what the neurobiological mechanism is, but I think that these are important observations. The biology is telling us that this isn't fantasy. that we're talking about. It is real. These children are perhaps as important as the programs like Reach Out and Read may be, if in fact we don't focus on parent-child interactions and the ability of the parent, in fact, to get the words into the ears of the child, we aren't going to make the progress that we otherwise could. Pediatrics must find a way to move from child care to family care, at least for those elements of family health that determine child health outcomes. I'm not saying we need to become family physicians, but I think we can no longer just blindly or with blinders focus on the child. So what are the risks that we should target? There are many, and they're biologic as well as environmental. And I'll only deal with 3 today, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but poverty, chronic stress, chronic disease, which is actually a chronic stressor, along with many others. But let's just talk about the 3 for a minute. 45% of all U.S. children in 2012 lived in low-income homes. That is, homes where total income was less than 200% of the federal poverty level. Half of these children lived in homes that were considered poor, that is, less than the federal poverty level, which sets income for a family of 4 at about $24,000. It is this sector of the pediatric population that is growing the most, more than 20% since the so-called Great Depression of 2008. What is most worrisome is that with each recession, more families move into poverty, and most of them do not climb out when there's an economic uptick. Poverty is growing, and so too the cognitive and behavioral health risks for children. I am reassured today that organized pediatrics, this is the Academy, I know those of you who are members of the APA, you pay attention to this, the Health and Medicine Division of the National Academy of Sciences, a number of federal agencies are considering how best to support the health of children who are economically disadvantaged. We need to have frank discussions about what part we as pediatricians can play. One path should be even more effective advocacy for greater equity and distribution of wealth. That's not a political statement. I think it's something that we all have to recognize. We also have to advocate for effective family support programs and for reimbursement systems that recognize that added cost of care is there for our systems for low-income children. Several recent papers in pediatrics begin to address the question, what can we do as pediatricians in our practices to mitigate the adverse effects of family poverty? And there are a couple of things. I really recommend that you look at the last 2 issues of Pediatrics, because there are several good articles. But we can use our medical homes to assess each family's financial stability and respond to health needs attending economic stresses. We can also better align practice structures and processes with the needs of families in poverty. A second risk factor for cognitive and behavioral outcomes is chronic stress, and I'm not going to spend time or going over the ACEs again, just to say that as originally defined by Felitti in his study in Southern California of people in the 5th and 6th generation of life, he found that there was a broad range of adverse kinds of experiences in the categories of child abuse and household dysfunction that really did or were associated with poor health outcomes, both behavioral and medical in the adults that he studied. There have been other studies that have in fact modified the ACEs, especially to look at childhood populations, and the outcomes have not been any better for adolescents and for children as young as kindergartners. I list here some of the adult and childhood health outcomes reported following exposure to multiple ACEs, and I'm not going to go into that, but let me just talk about one I think, particularly compelling observation. This was reported in Science nearly 2 years ago by Campbell and colleagues from a well-controlled, long-term follow-up study of the Abecedarian Project at the University of North Carolina. Children from low-income rural homes were randomized to usual care or to enriched daycare experience for the first 5 years of life. 25% of controlled children developed metabolic syndrome by their mid-30s. But none of the intervention group developed the obesity, hypertension, and diabetes triad. While many studies of ACEs have reported associations, these data, to my mind, cannot be dismissed as lacking demonstration of causal linkage. And this is a slide that was presented 2 weeks ago at a congressional briefing in Washington, D.C. by Dr. Rahil Briggs, but it just shows the dose effect relationship of ACEs to several behavioral disorders. We can't run away from these kinds of data. And the fact that as pediatricians, we are in a position to promote nurturing environments that help families and will avoid many of these risks. So how do we do this? Let me just talk about something that is going on to promote primary care situations as places where, in fact, we can have an effect. And then I'll talk a little bit about subspecialty pediatrics. First, let me talk about a collaborative on family-focused prevention in primary care that's been launched by the Children's Cognitive, Affective, and Behavioral Health Forum of the National Academy of Sciences Board on Children, Youth, and Families. This collaboration is populated by social scientists and behavioral scientists and physicians and nurses and psychologists, et cetera. The Academy of Pediatrics and the American Board of Pediatrics are well represented on this collaborative. A major focus has been preparing primary care settings to enhance parenting skills. Activities of the collaborative include a number of review and viewpoint articles. One of these is coming out next month in JAMA Pediatrics and is first authored by Ellen Perrin. Also, there's been a recent congressional briefing. There's been a coordination with the Academy on strengthening Bright Futures recommendations and several workshops. And in fact, the next workshop will occur in late November, and it will address the interdisciplinary workforce needed to implement family-focused cognitive and behavioral health promotion. Why so much expectation placed on primary care? Well, first of all, it's the only place that I can think of where there is universal or nearly universal access. In primary care, we as pediatricians see children frequently in the first couple of years of life, so there's that early exposure. There's an opportunity for universal cognitive and behavioral health promotion. And I'd like to reinforce what Jim said. I think that all families, in fact, can benefit from having at least some level of recognition within the pediatric office that this is important. Pediatric care is also a trusted program, and the people within the program are trusted, and I think it minimizes stigmatization. Finally, let me say, and this is most compelling to me, that if we keep this activity in pediatrics, we have an opportunity to combine information about both biological and environmental risk factors to focus most intensively on those families who are most in need. Ultimately, social determinants do need to be understood in terms of biological mechanisms, and this is an opportunity for interdisciplinary research in our departments that can feed our ability, in fact, to help those families and those individual children who need it the most. So what are the obstacles to this approach? Well, obviously, economics is one. CMS, hopefully, if we can create evidence, we'll be able to, or we'll be willing to adopt some innovative practices. If we create a good enough evidence base, hopefully there will be endorsement by the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. Many pediatricians say to me, well, you know, my child care agenda is already too full. I have too many things to do. The question is, what's important to cover with the families? And if, in fact, behavioral health is very important, I think we have to figure out how to work it in. But the way to do that, to my way of thinking, is to develop practices that are truly integrated and interdisciplinary. We have to figure out how to do that and how to pay for it. But if we begin to do it and show that, in fact, we're improving outcomes, I think the money will come. Finally, there are training gaps and deficiencies. Most of our pediatric residents, and actually subspecialty residents, are not required or expected to think when they see patients about the behavioral dimensions of the child or the family situation. And I think that we need to, in fact, figure out how to do that. So training our residents in a fully integrated interdisciplinary setting, I think, is a laudable goal. We have to figure out how to do that. Finally, let me just wrap up by sharing with you a program designed to mitigate the third risk for cognitive and behavioral disorders that I mentioned, that being disabling and life-threatening chronic disease. This is a stressful situation. Up to 8% of children in the U.S. have a chronic disabling disorder. 2% of all U.S. children are receiving SSI benefits because they have a severe disability and live in a low-income home. These are patients that populate many, if not most of the beds on our inpatient services. The attending stress is a risk factor for cognitive and behavioral health trajectory of both the child and family members. Current evidence documents more frequent anxiety, depression, ADHD, and substance use. Children with chronic diseases frequently are emotionally and cognitively unprepared for success in school. Using cystic fibrosis as a case in point, while outcomes have improved and half of all patients are now 18 years of age or older, the average age of death is still in the 20s. Both mothers and fathers have a high rate of anxiety and depression, almost half for mothers in the first 3 years after a diagnosis. And as many as 20, and I've seen figures that are higher, 20% of patients are clinically depressed. Children in these families, or those families that are economically challenged, as determined by Medicaid eligibility, have much, much poorer outcomes. The standard model for CF care, I think most of you know this, is really time-consuming. It includes lots of medications, it includes airway clearance, it includes nutrition support, and too often it includes repeated hospitalizations. What's missing? It is our hypothesis at the Cincinnati CF Center that management of stress and promotion of wellness and resilience for patients and their family members, if included in the care model, might improve family quality of life, coping with care, and health outcomes. So we have created and are in the process of implementing a care model that we call CF Well. WELL stands for Wellness Education and Learning Laboratory. We are developing programs to improve patient and family sleep quantity and quality, foster family-focused exercise, introduce brief mindfulness interventions for the management of mounting stress, and enhance patient resilience and ability to achieve independence in adulthood by preparing children for school success and supporting that success throughout the school years of the kids with CF. CF Well is being rolled out at this time to families at the time of diagnosis, and it'll be reinforced regularly. It is our opinion that this program will only work if it's implemented as a partnership with families. In other words, a co-production effort, an effort that accounts for their needs, their preferences, and their goals. Given the high prevalence of disabling chronic disorders in children, whether they be the consequence of prematurity or other neurodevelopmental problems or asthma or metabolic disorders or any of the thousands of rare diseases that we have to deal with. There is a need to disseminate approaches that are shown to improve family quality of life, resilience, and ability to cope with the unrelenting demands of a chronic care child. We hope to use the CF Center network to learn how to scale up these kinds of interventions. And I think that there are many other chronic diseases that could, in fact, take advantage of this approach. It's my hope that, in fact, we can have an effect on population behavioral health of children by concentrating on those who really need this kind of help. The challenges for pediatric research, if we're to improve cognitive and behavioral outcomes, include creating an evidence base for efficacy and effectiveness of any of these interventions, and then by rigorously documenting what works as we attempt to disseminate interventions. These are the challenges that I hope our pediatric community and some of you will embrace. Those of us in child health care can contribute to better outcomes by moving into promotion, prevention, and early intervention modes that reduce child and family stressors and lead to better cognitive and behavioral health outcomes. We certainly will have to partner with colleagues in the community and with our schools, but we must be leaders rather than followers. I think the opportunity is within reach. There is increasing attention. I think there is increasing passion to do something at this time. I hope you see the prize, that is healthier children, adults, and families, as worth an all-out effort. So I show here Cincinnati Children's Psychiatric Hospital, well over 100 beds, and it's overflowing into the general pediatric wards at a rate of about 20 or 25 a day. These are children in crisis, and they do need help. But the question I leave with you is, can we create child health care systems that will one day make this kind of facility obsolete? I believe that the timing is right to get serious about this kind of mission, and I hope that all of you agree with me. And so thank you for your attention.